Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for making time this evening to join us for this dialogue. We're joined by Lindiwe, Devile, and Nolita. They're going to be our panelists for this evening. If you missed the workshop that we had on Monday, we were exploring capacity. We explored how we can build capacity in order to support movements, start movements, as well as sustain movements. And in this conversation today, we want to kind of explore how then do we actually move to building movements while also getting firsthand experience, basically. We just want to hear our panelists, what their experience has been in the space, and how it is we can build movement, right? Because we've now understood from the Back2Basics Workshop that collaboration is very important and partnerships as well. However, we need to know how to captivate them. We need to know how to build capacity in order to make sure that our work continues forward. So our panel today is one that will be exploring capacity building for communities, grassroots organizations, as well as movements. And the hope is that we can gain insight from these individuals who work toward facilitating capacity building, movement building, community mobilizations, as well as relationship building, among many other things. The conversation is meant to help us understand how we can know what our capacity needs are. So like, how can we actually assess what we need from a capacity perspective as individuals, as well as organizations, and how we can then effectively address them or effectively enact change. Our dialogue today is going to be conversation-based, so it's going to be more like a conversation. And I am just really, really excited to be hosting them. And before we get into the actual conversation, a few things to get out of the way. The first is that if you do have a contribution or you've got a question that you'd like to ask, please use the chat and we will sort of break for a Q&A. And once we do that, then you can maybe unmute, you can put your hand up, and then we can take it from there. But while the conversation is sort of in progress, it would be really awesome if you can put your hand up. And that would mean to please make sure that we can keep our mics off just as other people are speaking, and to practice the rule of two that we always practice, which is wait for two other contributions after you've contributed before you contribute again. I really hope that this conversation will help all of us. I really hope that this conversation will help all of us understand how we can succeed across many different movements that we get involved with, as well as how we can understand what we can give and how we can give it for social change. Right, so without further ado, I would like to welcome the panelists to the room and to the space. We gather almost every other month, and a lot of the times, according to need, it can be every month. And this is just a space for learning. This is a space for understanding the movements that we get involved in. So what I'm going to do, and I often like to do this because, you know, like when you introduce other people, then it's not always in the way that they would introduce themselves. So I always like to ask people to introduce themselves because I think that's the best way to do it. So I'm going to start with asking Nolita, only because your mic is on at the moment, so I can see you, to please introduce yourself to the space. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you for having me, everyone. You can read my bio there on the very well-prepared presentation. It's really long. Yeah, I'm not, do I read about it or do I add an additional fact to whatever I've added on this bio?
You can kind of just speak to us.
Okay.
So who are you? We want to know who you are. I mean, a bio is amazing because we read it and we know you're a qualified chemical engineer, but who actually are you?
Well, I'm someone who likes to have jokes, have fun. I am from Durban. I born and raised there, but I'm Xhosa speaking. So my family is from the Eastern Cape. I'm from there too, but it's complex because I wasn't born there, etc. And I'll keep it short in that I value positive vibes. I value equity. I value things that create improvement and create a better society. And that's kind of what has informed a lot of the decisions I've made about my life and where I am right now. So I am very honored to be here, very excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
I'm so excited that you were able to join us, and already with the positive vibes and valuing all the things that we also value in this space is making me very, very excited to have you on here. So thank you so much for that intro. We'll all be coming back to this bio, so if we don't get to it right now, please guys be just a little bit patient because we'll be coming back to it. Lindiwe, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Okay, hi Michelle, hi everyone else. My name is Lindiwe Johnson. I am, I come from a sustainable development background, and I currently work as a green economy skills development senior analyst at Green Cape. And yeah, we have a project that focuses on grassroots level climate literacy program and capacity building program in the Eastern, Western, and Northern Cape. I also like to laugh a lot. I'm from Cape Town, actually. Yeah, I think that's pretty much me.
Great, very exciting. I think one thing that's consistent here is that we all like good vibes. That this panel, this discussion is going to be one full of good vibes, and I like that. Ndivile, I know you're also with us. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, by all means. Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Michelle, for inviting me to be in this space. Yes, my name is Ndivile Mokoena, and I refer myself to myself as a climate, gender, and social activist. I am a project coordinator of an NGO called Gender CC Women for Climate Justice. And yeah, we work on climate and gender justice. Our work focuses mainly on advocacy, capacity building, training, and yeah, working on policy assessing and analyzing policies. Yes, I have been in this space for quite a long time, and I am here because of my passion. Otherwise, my background is in marketing and communication, but yeah, I decided to leave the corporate world and said, this is where my passion is. I am joining the development sector. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. And I think just before we get into it, I'll just go through the bios a little bit and then we'll get straight into the conversation. So one thing that I really like about all of these bios, one thing that's very consistent is the part about building capacity, which means that a lot of what we're here for is going to be answered, because that's one of the questions, that's one of the big questions that we had. And on Monday, for Monday's conversation, it ended up kind of going to how do we build capacity to be able to engage with funders. And since in this space we've dealt with funders and grants to whatever extent we have, I'm sure that we can be able to answer that. But it would be worded a lot better later so that we can properly answer it. So I'm really, really excited about that. Ndivile has a lot of experience on climate change, gender and social issues since 2010, when she joined Earthlife Africa, Johannesburg Women's Forum called Women in Energy and Climate Change Forum, working with women cooperatives on energy, agricultural, and other social issues that affect the communities exacerbated by climate change impacts, engaging with national and local governments on the integration of gender and social issues into climate change adaptation and mitigation policies, and the Just Transition Framework, currently working with various communities, especially women and youth, on a community-led and gender-just transition. And this is so important because oftentimes when we speak climate change and climate justice, it's so important for us to also focus on that women and children part, because a lot of the times they are the most affected. So again, Divile, we welcome you to the space. Nolita is a qualified chemical engineer and is from South Africa and has experience in waste management and has worked for one of South Africa's largest municipalities after graduation. She joined Unilever as a process engineer working on innovation and innovation management. Nolita is currently a program manager at the Club of Rome, an accomplished speaker and leader supporting the emerging new civilizations and new youth hubs. She focuses on building global initiatives toward regenerative ecosystems, looking at innovation, cultural and intergenerational approaches to sustainable human development. She co-leads the Global Youth Engagement Program, the 50%. Previously, Nolita led a social enterprise incubator at UCT, co-created and contributed to local and global youth entrepreneurial programs, and has worked at an ed tech startup. So that's an edu tech startup. And then lastly, Lindiwe is a green economy skills development senior analyst at Green Cape and holds a degree in sustainable development from Stellenbosch University. Lindiwe joined Green Cape in 2016 and has informed a technical lead role in the energy, looking at electric vehicles, for instance, civil society, gender and social inclusion, looking at youth and women empowerment, and capacitation of decision makers to procure green economy projects. Her insights into cross-sectoral barriers and industry opportunities have empowered emerging platforms to address skills development needs and potential growth in green economy industries for future. And she presently leads the Active Climate Change Citizen Project, which aims to capacitate South Africans on climate change and active citizenship, with the critical part of her work concentrated on increasing active citizenship, supported and facilitated by capacitated and engaged CSOs. So what I like is that consistently the word capacity is kind of coming up. So I'm sure you can tell that I can't contain my excitement for today's discussion in the area of climate change in South Africa. And some of the key activities of this work is to enable and empower disadvantaged communities, especially women and youth, with platforms to express their views on a variety of climate and energy policy, public policy processes through advocacy and social inclusion. So again, a very, very warm welcome to the three of you for being part of the space today. So we've heard a little bit about yourselves. What we haven't heard is how you got into this space. So I think that's kind of where we're going to start. I'm going to start with you, Nolita. How exactly did you come to the space? How did you end up being a practitioner in the space? And maybe was it always your dream, or what was that situation?
Okay, thank you. How did I come into the space? I will maybe challenge the point on me being a practitioner a little bit, because right now my role is more about knowledge production than it is about practicing in grassroots organizations. But how I came into it, as it says in my bio, I led a social enterprise incubator when I was on campus. And that was when I realized that I have a skill in when I meet a new idea, I have a skill in being able to figure out how to make it into something viable. So as you said, capacity. And there's something about when you're young and you discover that you're good at something and that you become a little bit obsessed with it. And that's how I got into it effectively, is that I was like, oh, okay, give me more ideas, give me more reasons to try and figure out how to make things, how to make the best of things as viable as possible. That is kind of how I ended up into the space. The story of how I really, really got into it is probably something to be discussed over dinner, because it's a story of circumstances. As you can see in my bio, I was very much headed towards a career in engineering, had a decently healthy career in engineering, but life had other plans, and curiosity kind of led me to this particular phase of where I am now.
So what I'm hearing is that we all need to schedule a dinner with Nolita so that we can properly hear what this story started. But thank you for that. I think it's so interesting because a lot of the times I've noticed that when people get into the space, sometimes it's because it's a product of circumstance, right? And I think it's so interesting because of where our world is headed. I'll give an example of myself. I am a computer scientist and I absolutely love computer science. But here I find myself in this space as a product of circumstance, as a product of the changes that our world is doing. So I could definitely kind of relate to that, headed toward one aspect of a career and then you realize, hang on, there are all these other gaps, and so I should kind of focus on that. So thank you for telling us about where your career kind of started and how you kind of got into it. We'll hold you to that dinner invite. Next, Ndivile, could we ask you to kind of tell us how you kind of got started, how you got into the space, so on?
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. There's rain in my area, so my network is kind of unstable. So that is why I can't open my video. I hope you don't mind.
Not at all.
Yeah, but how I got into the space, I think it's through passion, because since as a young girl, I have been so passionate about social issues, development issues, children's rights and women's rights. So I started off volunteering while I was working in the corporate world in various organizations, since from the time of HIV and AIDS era. And I was trained as a counselor. I was doing counseling as well. I did a lot of volunteer work at children's home. And I got into the space of environment and gender issues and governance issues through a social ministry in the church. And it was just one time when I felt that I'm no longer getting the fulfillment in the work that I am doing. I'm working in the corporate world and doing well, but there is no fulfillment. And I knew where my heart was, so I decided just to resign, started volunteering until I managed to get a permanent post in this space. So yeah, I'm happy and I'm enjoying every minute of it. Thank you.
You're on mute, Michelle.
Thank you. I think this should be better now. Thank you so much for that, Ndivile. I think that must have been very bold, just making that decision to say, because of passion, I'm going to be focusing on this, and that whatever happens, happens. Because as young people, a lot of the times we often hear that passion doesn't pay the bills or it doesn't put food on the table or something like that. But I almost want to think that this is a completely different world that we live in. And so passion does pay off. And that makes me very, very excited. Lindy, we're over to you. How did you get into the space?
Thank you for the question, Michelle. So my story is also a little bit of a weirder one. Also started off in the waste energy space. Was very passionate about it at first. But I always had an affinity and always was very keen on volunteering and keeping myself busy with, activism like work. And so as a student, I used to volunteer at the Gender Equity Unit at the University of the Western Cape. And that was kind of one area where I kind of saw where I am quite interested in understanding how do you get agency behind messaging for disadvantaged groups. But then when you start your career, you kind of I didn't kind of find my feet easily. And so when I started working, I actually started working within the waste space. So really focused on circular economy. But in that space, I was already doing some capacity building work because a lot of the work we focused on was assisting businesses to understand how do they look at their waste streams better. And it's kind of there that I kind of found my voice to figure out how do you actually speak to different types of groups. Because I think I was so used to speaking to only in a student demographic that now I was now put in a space where I'm also speaking to businesses. And then I saw a colleague of mine who was doing skills development related work. And I was very interested in what she was doing. I was like, that seems so much cooler than what I do. And it just seemed like aligned very much with the passion I had as a young person or as a student, and its ability to actually kind of speak to both young, old, government, non-government, business, different types of audiences, but still in a way that is somewhat educational, and that kind of was my in. So I kept on volunteering for her projects and just kept on putting my hand up and said, I really like your work. I just want to get to know it a bit better. And eventually, when she left, I actually applied for a role. And I basically created my own portfolio of types of projects and that kind of speak to the person that I am and the interest that I have in making sure that the groups, the previously disadvantaged groups that I am passionate of advocating for are actually advocated through the work within the green economy or the climate change space, which is something that I had not actually seen a lot before. So yeah, so that's kind of my story.
Cool. So there are two things that I'm hearing from your story. One is that you're eyeing your friend's job. And the second is that, we should all be sort of in spaces where we can, we should position ourselves in such a way that we can, apply for positions, get them, and enact change. Because if we don't do that and we wait around for people to kind of create these opportunities for us, it's going to be very, very difficult. So I really quite like from everything that we've heard, just in terms of how they got into the space, is that there was to some extent this sort of creation of like their own luck almost. And I don't like to use the word luck because I don't always think that it's true, but it just kind of sounds like if you position yourself well. And I think it also, I'm going to be linking it to the conversation that we're having on Monday as well. It also speaks to, I think, partly answers that question of how do we build capacity. So like what we're hearing now is you position yourself in a position where you can build capacity just from a skills development perspective. So in terms of volunteering, for instance, or getting involved with campus-related initiatives, those are some of the ways that people can build capacity to be able to engage on so many different levels with the things that they're passionate about, or even the roles that they envision themselves taking. So that is really, really great. So now what I'm trying to then get into is, because we keep throwing this word around, like capacity building, right? Like we get involved in capacity building work, and like I was building capacity at this point, and this is how I was building capacity. But we, like in the audience, kind of don't really know what the meaning of capacity building is, and I speak on behalf of everyone. So this is just to ask, in your understanding, what is the meaning of capacity building for social movements specifically, and especially within an African context? And I'll start with Lindiwe. If you can just please tell us in your own kind of understanding, what is capacity building for social movements, especially from an African context?
Sorry about that. The power just came on. So I think on my side, capacity building really looks at how are you essentially working with stakeholders so that they are developing and building certain skills or abilities, or understanding certain processes, or even identifying certain resources within their organizations or within their community, and then looking at how do they use those now identified or developed skills, abilities, processes, resources, and then then moving that on to actually using it in a way that would then benefit them and the spaces that they then work in. So I think for us, it really then looks at specifically in the skills development space, it's all about then what type of skills do you then focus on in order for someone to actually become better at their job, or be able to reach more or do more within the task within their existing work that they do. So I think that's kind of more or less what I would classify capacity building. It's quite a difficult one now that you've asked it to me. Because I think we just use it and you don't even sometimes think about it. But yeah, thank you for the question.
No problem. I think we use it so much to the point where we just kind of always assume that everyone in the room must understand what capacity building is. And I think that's one thing that we do as people who work in spaces that we work in, right? Is we use a term so much that we get to a point where it's just part of who we are. And we're like, well, it's capacity building. What do you mean? So thank you for defining that for us a little bit more clearly. I think it's very, very helpful. Nolita, I am also going to ask you for your understanding of capacity building and for social movements, as well as what that could potentially mean for the African context.
Okay. My understanding of capacity building, I mean, capacity means expanding your horizons of possibilities to do what you want to do. That's basically what it means. And as we saw in with, all the speakers introducing themselves, it has a lot to do about your inner game and your outer game, meaning you as a person. An important part about social movements is that they are based off a common understanding or a belief of that something needs to move from one state to another state. And for someone to lead or participate in that, they need to be people who have developed themselves, meaning that your internal meaning needs to match your making. And when that happens, that's the first key for capacity building, because then any question you're asking yourself about what am I supposed to do next, what decision am I supposed to do next, is very much matched to what that meaning is. That's what your making becomes. Simon Sinek says, start with your why. But I think why is he then talks about Apple, et cetera, which is like a corporate why. But when it comes to the work of justice, et cetera, this is work of values, which means you start by assessing yourself and your own values. And that's when you start making decisions in terms of capacity, et cetera. That's when you have the bravery to make the decisions, like one of the speakers has, to leave a job, to go do something else, et cetera. That's when that's the initial capacity you have to build. When it comes to social movements, it's about community, viability, credibility. Community meaning the people around you, so collaboration. That's what Michelle mentioned at the start of the call, like collaboration, partnerships, etc. But also, are there people who believe in the same things you believe in? Are there people who believe in just energy transition, etc.? And to build the capacity for that, half the time it's about having conversations, meeting people, being open to having conversations, which is difficult, especially when not all of us are well, first, self-belief is an important one, because if you don't believe you have anything valuable to say, then you don't find yourself speaking to anyone. So it's about building the capacity to tell your own story. Tell your own story well enough that other people would like to share with you their story. So community building is also about your capacity to listen to other people and listen to other organizations to find a common ground. Movements are made by the people in them. So it's about being a brave navigator of what it means to really actualize this thing that you say that you care about. If you're saying you care about climate justice, you need to then have the internal, but also the ability to communicate and convene people to then bring that forward. Viability is probably one of the difficult ones, because viability speaks to Do you have money? What are you able to live? Where are your leverage points? Do you understand what it means to leverage? Are you focused? That's another challenge I see a lot when it comes to practitioners, is like focus, because then when you're chasing opportunities, you then struggle to focus on what you're good at. Because one of the critical things you need to figure out quickly is, what am I good at? And once you figure that out, then you conquer the basics. Conquer the basics means that whatever you're good at, is it replicable? And can you share it with other people? And that's when, over time, that is how capacity is built. Because once you know what you're good at, once you know how you can share it with other people, then you know how to fundraise for it. Then you know how to build a community around it. And because you can do it consistently over time, then you are able to then build credibility. But credibility is more than just, can I host a certain type of dialogue? Can I produce a certain type of knowledge? Can I make sure that this resource at this community on time, etc.? It is also about honesty, transparency, and integrity. So now we're gone back full circle, where meaning and making are very important. That fundamentally is my understanding of capacity building.
Thank you so much for that. Both of you, really. I think what I'm also seeing is just that relationship between that initial sort of conversation that we're having around skills development. And now what I'm kind of hearing is, you know, like looking at what it is that you're good at. So how does what you're good at build credits for you, credibility? How are you going to walk into a room and say, I know something about this, and people are actually going to listen to you? And I think I had a question on that is, so how do I know what I'm good at apart from sort of practicing, right? So this is not just a question to the panel. It's just sort of like a question that came to me. If we're going to then be talking about what I'm good at, is this something that I can then build on, right? So coming back to that capacity building, can I become better at something, thereby building capacity for that thing? And then, you know, leaning into it a little bit more and kind of becoming more comfortable with it. So I think there was a kind of the questions that we then need to be asking ourselves in the space when we do the work that we do, because without asking ourselves these kinds of questions, like what actually are our values, what is it that I want to develop on so that I can do this? So what I'm also kind of hearing is mapping out, and we were kind of also hearing this from the introductions, is what I'm seeing also is very consistent here is this mapping out of where I want to be and then taking action to get to where I want to be, right? Like we heard with the leaving the jobs, with the eyeing other people's jobs, that sort of thing, and the changing career trajectory altogether. I think all of that is very important, because then we're able to then measure, which was a question that we heard earlier, right? How do we measure this thing? How do we measure that this thing is working? If we have a goal, how do we measure that it has come true, right? And I like that so much, because it just does not apply to the work that we do. So when we look at the projects, we're not just looking at the projects. We are also saying, me personally, for me to get to become a UN representative, these are the steps that I'm going to take. And this is how I'll know that I've reached that goal. So I really quite like that. I also really like this idea of like self-belief. So what is it that I believe in, and what are my values? And I think that also then allows us to then concentrate on the skills that we would need to have for us to be able to drive positive change, especially from a community perspective. Ndivile, I also know that you work in communities a lot. I've engaged you quite a bit on that work specifically. And I think in addition to what your idea of capacity building is, I would also kind of like to know like what your experience has been in the areas that you've worked in, especially in the communities that you do with women and youth. So what have you seen to be some capacity gaps? And one, how have you worked to address them? Or how have you seen them being addressed by others? So I think that's kind of like a two-part question around kind of also sharing your idea of what capacity building is, especially for social movements. And then secondly, in the work that you've done, in the communities that you work in, what you've seen to be some of the gaps. It could even be gaps that have been addressed. So what have you seen to be some of the gaps? And how have you worked to address them? How have others worked to address them? And I think if at all possible, it would be really, really cool to hear, even hear kind of like a timeline, like this is where we started, this is where we were 2 years ago, and this is where we are now.
Thank you, Michelle. I totally agree with Lindiwe and Nolita in their explanation of what capacity building is. Just to add on that, I will just relate a story of a shelter of abused women, which I was volunteering at years back. These women, because of the situation they were exposed to, they lost their self-esteem, they had no confidence, and they believed that they were wrong in all areas, in all circumstances. And some of them even believed that they deserved to be physically abused, emotionally abused. You know, they were reduced to feel that they are nothing. You know, they were reduced to a doormat level. So through capacity building that was taking place in the shelter, these women were able to stand up for their rights, for who they are. They were able to have a voice, to be able to say and express how they feel, what they want, and what are their emotions. And some of them, they even developed, I mean, they could even identify their strength, their skills, and those who were even housewives, they felt they can do something about their lives and they can be able to provide for themselves. So just in a nutshell, this is what capacity building can do, as was explained by the two ladies. But, you know, in my words, I would say it is a process by which individuals or organizations obtain, improve, and retain the skills, knowledge, tools, equipment, and other resources needed to do their jobs competently. And at community level, it is necessary to help to build resilience and sustainability in order for the communities to be able to overcome exclusion and suffering. And also at community level, it can mean, it can include social, behavioral, and mindset changes that can lead to advancement, growth, and development. And yeah, for social movements, obviously, capacity can also mean collaboration and partnership. Now, looking at some of the gaps that one has come across or experienced in this work, is working in silos is one of the gaps that as social movements, we tend to work in silos. We tend to compete and work against each other. And also the issues that we intend to address are addressed separately rather than looking at the holistic approach. For an example, if you want to address climate change, you cannot address climate change outside of equality, equity, and poverty, etc. So we need to start looking at the intersectionality of issues at hand. So yeah, I think I will stop there for now. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you, Ndivile. And I think that's very important, right? Especially when we start looking at, I had not even started to think at silos. So this idea of working separately and isolated from other people, I have not even looked at it as a capacity gap. And you have definitely changed the way that I think about capacity and even the way that I would be approaching this process of capacity building in future, because it's often so important that we work together. And I think that's where that collaboration idea comes in, because, you know, if I am missing something and maybe it's not my specialty, but someone else in the audience is good at that, the only thing that makes sense would be for us to sort of collaborate, right? So I really quite like that idea. And also this idea of making sure that the communities or the movements that we are part of are resilient ones. It would also mean that when we look at capacity building, we're also looking at it as a form of adaptation, because often when we speak about adaptation, I've noticed oftentimes it is about like food gardens and making sure that people are food secure, but oftentimes it doesn't move toward that and into this idea of like building capacity for you to be able to adapt to the changes that are coming so that you can become more resilient. So it all becomes then very, very sort of related. And I really quite like that. So thank you for sharing that, and thank you for sharing your experience with that. At this point, I want to break for a little bit and just find out from the audience if anybody has a question for our panel. You are free to raise your hand. You are free to type in the chat if you've got a question at this point in time. And if your question will come after, that's also fine. I see Lerato, your hand. Go ahead, Lerato.
Evening, everyone. Thank you so much for the great presentation always, Michelle, and I'd love to thank the wonderful panelists. Great stuff. And I'm so happy they're all female. Yay, power to us. My main question is, how do we then, okay, basically I want to get the pros and cons in terms of capacity building, because I feel no matter how passionate you may be, or whatever goodness you may do, but somewhere down the line, you just don't get it right. And it may be a simple task like mobilizing for a march or a walk, and it just doesn't turn out. And you just think, okay, I notified my network, I sent emails, I was calling, I sent WhatsApps, I even tried to make people get transport, and even catering for food, but it just doesn't become a success. So I just want to know, what is that one thing that one of the panelists may answer to say, we actually get it wrong this way in terms of doing capacity building, because I just feel some things just don't become a success, and when you try to check the root cause or the problem of it, you just don't get an answer. So yeah, that's definitely my first question. Thank you.
Thank you, Lerato. I am gonna allow for whoever unmutes first to start with answering that. So if I heard you correctly, you were asking what the pros and cons of capacity building can be, and then you gave this example of trying to mobilize and then people maybe not showing up. So yeah, how do we sort of navigate that? A question to the audience.
Okay, I'll go first.
Cool, go ahead.
Okay, so it definitely is a challenge to get commit, because I think sometimes it can come down to a commitment thing as well. I think what has really worked well with us, and I'll speak from a personal and from a project standpoint of view, is the fact that we took a long time, and I know everyone doesn't have the luxury of time, but we invested a lot of time in understanding the ecosystem that we are going into. So that means we did quite a bit of work understanding who are the different stakeholders that are actually playing in this space. So you can thinking about your various maybe civil society organizations, your community-based organizations, thinking about the role of the municipality, how are they viewed, just thinking of the role of community. Are they interactive? Are they not? Are they proactive? What is the sense on the ground? So we did a lot of work to understand the ecosystem that we were going to work in. And that means that we did quite a lot of interviews. We did quite a few engagements to understand what that looks like. We asked difficult questions like, who are the stumbling blocks? Who are the difficult groups to work with? Why are they difficult to work with? We also sometimes had groups that were completely opposing in the same workshop, but still allowed for we still allowed for conversation to continue, because we needed to understand what were the dynamics on the ground if we were to succeed in this project. So I think from our standpoint, building that ecosystem was essentially the most important building block in understanding and making sure that we actually have a successful pathway. After that, we then identified what we call our champions. So who are the people that you can actually rely on? So when you are trying to mobilize, when you are trying to host a workshop, a capacity building workshop, when you are trying to, just do any type of intervention, who is the person that you can rely on to rally the troops? Because say, for instance, you are not necessarily from that community, or you're not necessarily directly part of that group, you can't be the champion. Unfortunately, that doesn't always work. So you need to kind of go and find who is the champion that you can work with. And sometimes it's not the community. Sometimes it's not the community leader. Sometimes it's the person who's always at every meeting for whatever reason. Sometimes it's someone unbecoming who is your champion, but they just know how to get people to where you need to be. So you need to kind of just find that one, and you don't need a lot of people. You just need one person to kind of help you be a champion. I think, and then the very last step was to essentially build, and I think the previous speaker, she mentioned it, to have built somewhat of a morale and trust with whoever you're working with. That really sets the tone. There needs to be trust built between yourself and whoever you're working with. There needs to be some sort of common respect or morale between the people that are engaging with one another, and that kind of assists in your ability to actually transfer what you then want to get across, because everyone is then motivated and understands why this is important. And then sometimes question the why. Ask them, why are you here? It's not a bad thing. Ask them, why are they here? Why do they come back? And keep coming back. And then I think you'll find some interesting questions and answers, actually. So I think those are some of the key things that have really assisted us in working in different types of spaces, because our project is kind of linked to various target beneficiaries. We work from school teachers all the way to municipalities. And in each case, this has kind of been our recipe to penetrate and actually be able to then do impactful work and be able to actually get the people that will assist in driving something, and the people who then actually show up. So yeah.
Very cool. Thanks, Lindiwe. Thank you so much for answering that. And just at the very end there, what I'm also picking up on is this ability to be adaptable. So how can you work in different environments? How can you address different audiences? And I think that's also something that is learned, and a lot of the times it also comes through experience, which I find very valuable. Yeah, I really quite like this idea of like asking people why, because you don't want people to be involved just for being involved. You don't just want the numbers, you definitely want to be driving impact. And that's how we build strong social movements, right? For people who share these values, who share a common goal, and people can really get involved while understanding why they're getting involved. And I think that's very important. So thank you so much for that. And I think what we all need to do, especially when we heard about like identifying who's reliable, I think we also need to be reliable first, right? So if we're going to be driving something, it would be extremely unfair to expect other people to be reliable without us being reliable first. So just kind of maybe in addition to that is, while we're identifying people who are reliable, we also need to kind of set the example of being reliable there before we kind of, rope people into this mission that maybe we don't necessarily have good clarity on. So definitely that. I think we definitely build stronger movements when we understand the why, and when people understand the why, when we understand our values, and those are shared values, when we can collaborate and we can build capacity and make sure that our movements are not only sustainable, but also resilient. So thank you so much for that. I also see Lerato in the chat says, thanks so much. Lindy, we're still really beginning on questioning the why. So thank you so much for that. Andrew asks, how best can one monetize what they are passionate about? Which I find really, really like a cool question, because here we've heard a little bit about sort of volunteering, and then what I'm assuming is that at some point the volunteering stopped, because I mean, we've got to eat, right? So how best can one monetize what they're passionate about? I'll start with Nolita, maybe.
Okay. On the monetizing what you're passionate about, as I mentioned earlier, it does start with values. And when I say values, I mean values are basically the things that you find are important for your life. Those are very critical. And then from values, then you upskill yourself, right? And upskilling, when your skills match your values, that typically is where you find the window of the things that you're probably pretty good at, because you have the internal drive, the inner drive to pursue them. But now you also have the capacity to find opportunities to pursue them. On what the opportunities are, it really does depend on what exactly you are passionate about. And so I think my biggest first advice would be curiosity. Always ask questions. Is in asking questions, I think, like I said earlier in my introduction about you would need to sit down and talk to me about how I ended up doing the job I'm doing. Most of the story is that I just asked questions to the right people who are like, do you want to know more? I will teach you. And that's kind of what continued to happen over the course. I'm going to say the course of my life, but like I'm youth like most of the people in this course. So my life still has like a long way to go. But so far, that's kind of what happened. It's about you get to monetization by being curious, building community. So the same way we speak about capacity building for organizations, it is very similar to how you build capacity for yourself. So you build community by asking questions, also there's volunteering, but then there's also in sharing an experience and learning with people. And your friends and your peers are also very important for that, meaning that the people who share common interest with you, because then you learn with them. Once you've done the learning, you share it. And we live in an age of social media where sometimes half of the stuff that I get when people ask me to work for them is because I've shared my 2 cents on LinkedIn. That's a place to start, where I share my 2 cents on a topic on LinkedIn. And then over time, it does take time, because trust is not earned easily. Over time, then when someone is like, I am running this initiative and I'd really like to, I'm facing this problem, can you advise? And that's kind of how I ended up doing some of the stuff I do freelance. That is one of them. And I think for the people who are university students, I think a lot of our professions at this point do have an understanding or leaning towards sustainability and climate, because it is such a big problem. The problem of climate, the problem of community, the problem of resilience, the problem of adaptation is a problem that our countries, our cities are facing quite a lot. And it is a skill that a lot of organizations and institutions are looking for. But it's not a new problem. So it means like there are already quite a few professionals in the space, but does not mean that the space is limited or is small. So again, the curiosity and asking questions, like one key that I will give, what I used to do when I was a second year student, I used to go on Eventbrite because I was interested in social entrepreneurship. I used to go on Eventbrite, which is this app where people will publish their events. And if there are any free events hosted by an incubator or a startup, etc., so I did my research. I would go to that thing. I'd take the hidden jammy, go to the event at the UCT, GSB, etc., and just meet people and ask them questions. And that's how, like, I ended up working at a startup, etc., etc. It's just like taking the initiative to research, using the skills that you currently have and the skills that you're working on to create more opportunities for yourself, to work more closer to your passion if you're not currently at that place. Yeah, this one I could talk about for hours, but that's my opinion for now.
Cool, thank you. I keep hearing this idea of like that dinner having to happen. So just you wait. Lindy will also say.
Sorry, I was gonna say, if there's a free meal, I'm coming.
Maybe we'll organize. But Lindy says environmental climate-related careers significantly increased in the last 5 years. So I really quite like this, right? Because oftentimes when we think social movements, a lot of the times we're thinking volunteering. We're thinking working for NPOs and, giving our time. And things have changed in the last 5 years, right? You're actually able to make a career out of these problems that we're trying to solve, which makes me very, very excited, especially because we've got such a young audience today, is that if someone is still figuring out what they want to do, the opportunities are endless. You don't just have to become a lawyer or a teacher or a social worker. You can become, like an environmental consultant, a climate consultant. And this is where our panelists come in, because they would be able to really tell us how we get there, right? Like, how do I become this thing that you are becoming now? How do I analyze sustainability? What does that look like? And why does it matter, right? And I think those are some of the very important questions that also link to that why that we start to ask. But absolutely, I like this idea of like taking initiative, and almost, because it's so daunting when we hear that we have to create our own luck, that we have to like make things happen for ourselves. But then when it's broken down in ways that are doable, like go to free events, maybe, if that's possible for you, reach out to people on social media that you admire. That's one of the things that I used to do. I used to like cold message people. I don't know this person, I've never met them, but I love what they post. I'm like, I absolutely love what you do. And that's one of the reasons how I got into the space and how I got to where I am now. So I'm really, really excited that that kind of comes up, because it makes me feel like I'm not isolated. It also gives me a lot of power to kind of say to people, cold message people. All three of our panelists are on LinkedIn. I'm not saying spam them, but you know what? I've said what I've said. Yeah, so thank you guys for those questions. I kind of want to move into now. I liked what Lerato had said. Lerato was celebrating that we've got an all-female panel today, which is something to celebrate. So yay, it's one of the things that we're very intentional about at the African Climate Alliance. Ndivile, you work with women and children, but on the international stages that you've been on during the work, during sort of engaging with so many people, government, local, international, I know that, and I also know from not just hearing, but also from experience, that a lot of the times when we do this work, as women of color, we find that some of the times we are isolated. Some of the times we are one of 3 people in the building. At times we are one of 5 people in the building of 100, right? So the question then I have for you, Ndivile, is what are some practical things that we can start doing to ensure that when we are building capacity, we can do it for communities and movements in ways that center people, especially people of color, and their experiences?
Thank you, Michelle. Yeah, that is a very critical question, because in this work that we are doing, that's what we're struggling with. And it's not only a local thing, but it's also at international level. And it's not something that is just between the policies, the government, civil society, but we find that even within communities, even within the social movement, within ourselves, a social movement, even within women organizations, you find that prejudice that is always there. So yeah, I think we can never achieve development if the very most needy and vulnerable in our societies are left behind. And these are the groups that really need the capacity building that we're discussing more than anyone else. For us to be able to address equity, inequality, bridge the poverty gaps, build strong social safety nets, reduce the prejudices, have progressive social economic development, build resilience and sustainability. So we need to have an integrated approach that doesn't leave anyone behind. Otherwise, it means we haven't even started. doing the work towards sustainable development goals. So we need to be aware of the procedural mechanisms that are set to marginalize the poor, the vulnerable, people of color, women, and other genders. And also, you know, people have tend to have a tendency of, you know, hanging on to the privileges that we have, rather than creating a space where you empower people, you build capacity that everyone can be able to benefit from those privileges. And we sort of also tend to use buzzwords like justice, inclusivity, participation, leaving no one behind. But in the process, you find that greed, selfishness, power, and dominion overshadows all the right and good intentions. And yeah, so as I mentioned, that there is that temptation to hang on to privileges that are always a hindrance to equity and parity. So I think these are some of the things that we need to be aware of, need to be cognizant of, and make sure that everyone is given the space and the platform to create and build that parity and equity while we are in the process of building capacity and doing this work of development.
Thank you for that, Ndivile. I think it's so important for us to understand that a lot of the things, so like we obviously have built-in biases, but I think this also calls for us to be constantly in a state of learning, right? Like, how do I learn to not be biased? How do I learn to center people? Because I think that that is so important. When we work for social causes and for social movements and for justice specifically, we need to not become like the system, right? And I think that's then another word, another buzzword that then comes up, because we speak about the system so much that sometimes we don't often, you know, like define what it is, but definitely understanding that they're built in mechanisms that have been put in place that are meant to exclude others, that are meant to make others feel like they're not welcome. And so just this whole idea of like centering people in the work that we do becomes extremely important, because it not only means that we can do as much as we can to center people, it also means that we're constantly confronting our own beliefs. It means we're constantly confronting those values that we started with. What are they? Do they align with the work that I want to do? How do I do it to the best of my ability? And how do I also align with other people who are maybe less greedy and less selfish, so that these social movements that we're working for and this justice that we're pushing for can actually be realized and can actually become a reality. So then just following on to that is, now we kind of have heard a little bit about how we center people and their experiences when we are talking about building capacity, right? I think the conversation, what I really like about it today is it's linking to everything else that we've heard, right? So this idea of like understanding who you're working with, understanding your landscape, really understanding who it is that you want to work with, means that when you start the work, you are able to confront yourself better, right? Which is always a good thing. And at this point, I want to understand how critical it is to center BIPOC, so Black, Indigenous, people of color, or persons of color, in the various social movements that people get involved with across Africa. So how critical is it? And I think not just it's critical, but maybe also an example to follow up with it. So how critical is it that we center people who are maybe less privileged and more disadvantaged in our society, especially for pushing, you know, justice or these social movements that we get involved in? Go ahead, Nolita.
Yeah, I could go for it. Might be a little bit controversial. I challenge the term of centering. Because sometimes in the language that we use when we deal with these difficult things is that you actually create another polar instead of what we are fundamentally trying to solve is to create an equalizer, right? It's about humanizing everyone, because I'll use the word the system because I can't think of a better word right now, but like
I can't either.
I mean, I guess like the way that we live right now, we live in such a way that some people have less available to them because the way things are structured right now, they don't have access to that. The question of Indigenous people is even more complex because Indigenous people are not necessarily saying they want more access to things, but they're saying they want to preserve their way of living, their way of being. But even that is a very American understanding of Indigenous, because when you speak to an African person and they look like me, they will tell you they're Indigenous, even though I'm living in the middle of Claremont in Cape Town. So that there's like very varying understandings of what that means. UN has its own definitions, etc. But that is the challenge. The problem is that there are these definitions that then create another center of power that then fundamentally by itself creates a competition. The reason why when you speak to someone about decolonization, they will immediately, especially someone whose heritage has historically been advantaged by decolonization, is that they go to the defensive because you're speaking to them in the negative. So of course, then the only position they have, if there is someone who wants to do good things, is to try to measure how good makes them good enough. That's the challenge that we have on the work of centering. So it's more about humanizing. How in our work do we make sure that we recognize the humanity of everyone that we are interacting with? What does it mean to respect? And what does it mean for that respect to be matched by actions and behaviors? That is what I'm proposing a pivot more in that direction. Because what we have now is that, yes, it's good that we have a panel of all women, but we are now critically missing the voice of men. And it is that everywhere else outside of this panel is very much hetero male dominated. But in the work of trying to transition our society from one phase to another, it's slow. It would not serve it either to swing too much in the other direction. That is the unfortunate thing. But at the same time, there are critical things that have to be addressed in the work of trying to be equal. Also, you cannot forget the fact that at the end of the day, there is such a thing as gender-based violence, and it has to be addressed and it has to be focused on. It has to be a priority, because without it, then you have missed the opportunity again to do the humanizing work of making sure that we're all having this conversation on the same basis fundamentally. So I'm going to use the word of Ubuntu, as in that humanizing means that I can only become someone through other people. And through other people means that the success, the self-actualization of someone else, that then implies my humanity as a human being. So the centering part is more about how do we make sure that the self-actualization, the success, the presence, the voice, the value, all of the capacity building of someone else is not limited. Because once that happens, that is how I then become someone. That is how I become a human being, basically. Yeah, very esoteric answer. But that's why I think it's critical.
Right. Cool. So what was happening as I was taking some notes, and also just, I guess, also challenging my own kind of thoughts. And I think that's what I really like about these spaces, is they create an opportunity for us to kind of challenge whatever has been deemed the status quo. So I really quite like that. And I quite like what you were speaking about, essentially saying that we have to be hyper aware of overcorrecting, because then that presents a different set of problems that we would need then to kind of solve. So I really quite like that when we challenge this idea of centering, to be aware of what that could actually do, and how then do we make sure that when we try to center, we are then creating a space where it can be equal, right? Where I often don't like to use the voice of the voiceless, but where people who have been excluded historically can then be able to take part in some conversations. And I think that's very, very important when we do this work. And I really like this term of kind of challenging how we speak to people, right? Because often, and I think I find it a lot in the social justice spaces, when we do speak to people, a lot of the times it's almost like when we are selling a gospel, right? You almost approach somebody and you're like, if you don't do this, this will happen. I don't want to use the gory terms. So just to change that narrative and change the way that we speak to people, so that when we do approach them and we do engage with them, we're not speaking to them in the negative, because then no work will be done. Because if I want that person to be able to support the movement that I'm sort of a part of, then I need to make sure that they also feel part as much as I am, and not make them feel like because they're guilty of X, Y, and Z, they should be doing X, Y, and Z to make sure that everything is right, right? So I really quite like that. And I like this idea of like humanizing people for social change, because I think that's where a lot of the times when we do the work that we do, sometimes we can miss, there's so much opportunity for us to miss things when we don't humanize others. And I've been guilty of it. I think especially when you start out and you start getting these platforms, you just go into the defense and you forget that it's very, very important to also be humanizing people in the work. So that's really, really important. Yeah, so Lindy, where I see that your microphone, your camera has now come on, I do want to kind of rope you into the conversation as well. And yeah, I think the same question or the same conversation that we're still following. So how do you make sure that people are involved or included in the movements that we have and that we hold, specifically people who are historically marginalized? And then how do we then make sure that some value is brought to them through our movements, or even through building capacity?
So I think I'll start where I started in my previous section. It goes back to understanding, where are you entering? Like the space that you're entering into, the people you're engaging with, do you actually understand them? Do you understand where they are coming from? Do you understand the disadvantage that they are then coming from, or even what makes them prominent in that space? And that then brings the onus back to you as the capacity builder, to say that as the person bringing the knowledge, I have the responsibility to also not override and just I always say, like, always have this thing where we say you don't just go into a space and you bulldoze what it already exists. You don't go there and just completely say whatever has already been put in place is irrelevant. So it's making an effort to understand the people's voices who are there, understanding the challenges they are facing, and that is really done by having real conversations with them, making people humane. And like the previous speaker said, you don't want to create further isolation or further ostracize people even more by creating bigger spaces between people. So ideally, you want to create a safe space for engagement, a safe space to understand where people are actually coming from. What are the things that they bring to the table? Because they bring important information to the table. So how do you get that from them, rather than you just pushing onto them, and also kind of just recognizing them, but then at the same time you're also not actually seeing them for people who have value. So it really comes back to how do you make sure you see people and really see them for who they are, and then understand their humanness, and then making sure that in the process you are not eroding existing systems, but rather how do you add value to what is already existing in that ecosystem or within that group of people that you are trying to do any type of work in, whether or not to be capacity building or even skills development. It doesn't matter. But yeah, how do you then do that in a way that doesn't make people feel even more alienated, but more included into a conversation?
Right, thank you so much for that. And I think it's extremely important, even when we start using these words like safe spaces, how safe can a space really be, right? And how do we ensure that we so one of the things that I like to do when I walk into like facilitated spaces, and I happen to be the space holder and not necessarily a facilitator, is challenge everyone to make the space safe, right? So what that does in some ways is it means every single individual who's in the room, but then everyone also is able to participate in the safe space building situation, where then we can make the space as safe as it can possibly be, so that we can make sure that we've got people who are free enough to participate, but also are empowered or capacitated enough to meaningfully contribute to building this thing that would be amazing for them. So thank you for those contributions. I do want to note and say it, I don't like this part, but it's the part where I have to say we do have a few minutes left. And this has been an incredible, incredible conversation. We're not done yet. So please do not jump off as soon as it's 7 o'clock. There will be admin related stuff posted in the chat. For all those who are regulars here, you know what I'm talking about. For all those who aren't, please bear with me. We are moving toward kind of the end of the conversation, and I don't like to end things, especially when they're going so well, but unfortunately I must. But before we come to that official conclusion, we have been speaking a lot about, I think, building capacity in terms of skill, in terms of collaboration, in terms of creating spaces where people can meaningfully engage, creating spaces that can drive positive change, right? Spaces that are able to meaningfully support movements. And I think all of that is amazing. A question then comes as, first, how do we measure success? I think that's the first question. And I'm going to ask it as one question to every single one of our panelists. So how do we measure success? And then how can community-based groups or individuals, maybe if I ask this second part of the question, to just say that one of the things that I picked up throughout the whole conversation while the panelists were kind of speaking is that I should be building community as an organization, right? Because as much as an organization is an entity, so am I. So I think what I'm doing then is kind of using that community interchangeably, and I wanted it to be a thing where I'm saying community, but we all really collectively agree that it's community and individually, right? So the second part of the question then becomes, how can community-based groups build capacity in order to drive effective change? So in that can also be two other questions, right? Like, what are we defining as effective change? And I almost want to hear a little bit of that from the panelists as well. So what are we defining as effective change? How can we measure success? And how can I, as an entity, be it organizational or individual, how can I build capacity in order to drive that effective change? I am going to start with Ndivile this time around, and then I'm going to go to Nolita, and then we will hear from Lindiwe.
Thank you, Michelle. Can I quickly just build on what Lindiwe said, you know, when it comes to including everyone? Just quickly, you know, in working with climate change issues, it's important to have a holistic approach where you try to address all the intersectionality that goes with the impacts of climate change. When doing an impact assessment, you need to, in including everyone, find out how to the aged people, the elderly people, how are they impacted by climate change? People with disability, how does race come into the future? Because it's also part of the impacts of climate change. You know, you engage all the different groups so that when we address the issues, when interventions are done or programs are put in place, we have to make sure that those interventions, they do not exacerbate inequalities or end up disempowering people. Yeah, coming to your last question, how can community-based groups build capacity in order to drive effective change? I think the first thing, community groups need to be unified, you know, in their discourse. There has to be unity. They need to have a clear and common goal on what is it that they want as a community that will benefit everyone equally, and that will be able to determine what capacity is needed where and who has to be involved, which areas exactly need to be improved or need to be tackled for that community to be able to build have a common good which will benefit everyone. And in measuring success, I think it is important that during monitoring and evaluation processes, we look at the changes in well-being, in confidence, self-sustenance, and independence that translate into a transformation that has to take place into the community. So we have to measure all those things against what was the situation before we intervene with our capacity building. I think I'll stop there because of time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ndivile. In the interest of time, I will refrain from commenting and go straight to Nalita.
Thank you. I'm going to answer the how to measure success one, because I think that it probably implies the effective change part. I think, well, I might make a trial at the effective change question. On the change is effective depending on the impact it has on the community. So I'm also going to lean into Lindiwe's answer on that. The relationships you have are fundamentally important, because you can go and have an idea and say, for example, there's a litter problem at XYZ. And so for you, effective change will look like there's no litter. But if you don't have a conversation with the community, then it will be very difficult to understand what that change looks like, or what does a realistic goal in a certain timeline look like. And having that skill is very important, because if you're going to then ask people for their money to support this work, you need to be able to articulate how effective it is going to be. On the how to measure success one, this is something I'm currently going through right now, because one of the things I do is build like something similar to the African Climate Alliance, an international gathering of young people focusing on systemic transformation, specifically for human development and social equity, which is very broad and has a lot of things. And so the part of like, how do we then measure the success of said organization is a challenge I'm facing right now. What I have done so far is to lean into back in my engineering days, where we used to speak about flexible goals. So you choose 5 things that are defining characteristics of what success should look and feel like for you. So in a community-based environment, that means how do you improve the reach or the penetration of your organization? And that is very much measured in terms of like number of partners, number of people, number of XYZ. There is an intangible part of it, right? Because then there's an element of like, if you're doing skills development, how do you measure that someone has learned? if like, you know, other than like I've given people certificates, and that's a little bit more of a complex one. Then you go through the path of like doing an entrance testimonial and an exit testimonial and seeing what the difference is on that. There are many different models that really, it depends on how much money you have available, to be quite honest. And the simplest way, I've done it before, is you do an open survey or interview, and a closing survey and interview. And that kind of is how you kind of keep track of what that mindset shift has been because of the learning. Begin everything with an end audience in mind. And that's very critical to viability. And so that is also, it's like, it's a measurable thing, because then you say, I did this with this audience, this is the reach it created. I did this for this, and this is what it created, etc. I am low-key forgetting the last one. But a tip is that if you Google an example, the reason why I use the example from my engineering days is because when I was at the corporate I was at, they used to have growth fundamentals, 5 growth fundamentals. And that's how we used to measure our success. And they would be flexible, meaning that you're not always held on to the goal. Because when you don't have funding, you have to be opportunistic, meaning that if an opportunity comes that will give you more capacity, more lifespan, etc., and is contradictory to a goal, then you move. There is an element of what is my strategy versus what are my goals right now. And you have to play around with those, in that the strategy has to meet the goal has to meet the strategy. Sometimes you're making compromises, but the point, and that's why I started with values, is that if the values are consistent and kept the same, then you are not making compromises that are going to question your credibility. Because that's what happens often, is that the more people who are interested in funding you, sometimes it has to do with their interests, and you have to work in their interests. That's why they chose your proposal. And so you have to be careful ethically about what are they asking me to do? What impact is that going to have in the community fundamentally at the end? So that's, again, the relationships, the values become important. You cannot miss that. Once you've missed that, then everything else, you're measuring things that don't mean anything to anyone. You're making, you are supporting work that isn't driving the impact you're trying to drive. Yeah, and I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm exercising that thing where I don't comment after every speaker. So Lindy,
I feel like Nolita has kind of said everything. I feel like she's kind of put everything in such a beautiful summary that I almost don't want to add because I feel like it's such a great note. But maybe something just to reflect on how we've measured success through the work that we've done, and bearing in mind that we do have quite an array of stakeholders that you work with. Each one of them they also have their own lens of success that they see. So at the beginning of a capacity building workshop, we usually ask them, if you had to leave with one thing from the workshop, so this, before you even do anything, we usually ask, if you had to leave with one thing from this space, what would be the one thing that you would want to leave with? And that's kind of how you then build what is the expectations that's built from the audience. And it kind of allows you to gauge, okay, am I actually delivering what the people want, or am I not? Am I not? Have I completely missed the ballpark with what my audience actually is coming, the expectations my audience is coming in with? So that's just something we kind of do offhand, and you kind of just gauge to see what are people coming into the space with. But I think another thing we do is to put together what we call journey maps. Now, usually in projects, we don't have, these are actually just value adds to whatever project you're doing. And so we map out journeys of each of our stakeholders to say, okay, this stakeholder started here. They have done X, Y, and Z. So we actually do like somewhat of a little bit of an interview with our stakeholders. And unconsciously, they also start identifying everything they've done since they've started the process, the capacity building process. They then see, oh, actually, I did this. This is how I used the knowledge. This is where I applied what I learned. I didn't even realize I applied it in this way, but actually I applied it here as well. So unconsciously, you are also helping them see how they've actually started using the information that you have now imparted. So I created this little journey map, and we map out each of the journeys of majority of the stakeholders we then work with. We don't necessarily share it with anyone, but it's such a great way to tell the story of where someone started versus where they are going. Another way that we kind of, that I would say kind of measure success is also the ability of the community or the stakeholders, or the communities, their ability to identify their next step. We take it for granted, but having that next step is quite big, because oftentimes you walk into the space feeling fairly overwhelmed by a challenge. But when you leave, sometimes it's not for everyone, but sometimes people actually leave having a next step, and we take that next step for granted. And that is honestly, for me, sometimes a big win, whether they action it at that point or eventually action it. You have still planted a seed of a next step, which they would not have had they maybe not been in the space. So yeah, that next step is quite important. And yeah, I think that is where I'll end. I think those are some of my how we kind of measure success. It's not your conventional ways, but I think it's really cool ways of telling a story, of where people come from and how they've moved through the knowledge that has been shared.
No, absolutely. And I'm so tempted. And in fact, because I'm tempted, I'm going to make the request. If the three of you have any other additional stuff that you would like for us to share with the group today, please do send it, like the journey map and mapping out what success actually looks like and what does it feel like for me. So like these 5 growth fundamentals and all these really cool stuff that you guys have been throwing in here and there. I've been taking notes, but I realized that why not just ask the source, right? So if you guys have anything to share with us, please do. And just as we kind of move to the very end, it's a very short summary, and then I'll let everyone go because I do know how late it is. But some of the things that I picked up was to make sure that common interests are shared. So especially within our groups. So if we've got friends who do whatever it is that they do that we're interested in, to make sure that we sort of align, right? And this goes beyond just the friendships. This also speaks directly to who we choose to work with from an organizational perspective, from a collaboration perspective. And then also, making sure that when we do engage with different people, we make sure not to disempower people, and to always be mindful of that, because if we're going to be building capacity, that should almost always have a positive result. So we don't want somewhere along the line to be losing people, and then when we get to the end, we've got a bunch of negatives that we never even thought were possible. So making sure that we're always mindful of the different groups that we do engage with and how important that is. And then in addition to that, making sure that in whatever that we do, to make sure that there's unity. So not just with communities, right? Like communities should be unified, but if I'm going to work with an organization, to make sure that I'm also aligned with whatever it is that they're aligned with. Just unity makes things better, right? We know that if people are pulling in different directions, things won't work well at all. And I really quite like how we've heard about all these different ways that we can measure success. I think it's so important because oftentimes we want to act so much that we don't really have tools under our belts to measure the success and what it could potentially look like. So making sure that we understand that the change that comes is as effective as the impact it brings. I like that, because you can't just think of change being effective. You have to think about it from an impact perspective, and it's very important, right? And then also, beginning everything with an end audience in mind. I think that's something that I heavily move and walk away with today, is making sure that I'm not doing things blindly, because I'll end up measuring things that don't exist if I don't understand why I'm doing it, right? So that being very, very important. We heard a bit about the 5 growth tools. We will need those. Thank you very much. So please do email them when you get a chance. And then really just creating spaces where expectations can be expressed so that we're able to manage them. That again means that we're able to actually follow, the change that we've brought about, especially now when we're looking at journey maps. We're able to say, oh, because of these expectations, this is where we've been, or because we started there, this is where we are. And yeah, I think lastly, just making sure that we're able to identify gaps, skills, opportunity, and possibilities, because this then allows us to create a space that can encourage next steps. So in all of this, I think capacity really is making sure that whatever you do puts people at the center. You are not just working in a vacuum, you're working for movements and in movements. So an amazing thank you to our panelists today. This has been an incredible conversation. I don't want it to end here. Unfortunately, it must. So I am going to call it to a close and not keep anyone here longer than they should. So thank you guys so much. I almost want to ask for like a goodbye, but I feel like all of those last sort of conversations and contributions did it for us. So again, thank you so much for all of that. I did forget to ask you guys for how people can reach you. So what I'll do is I'll just follow up and ask you guys for how people can reach you. And then I will make sure to share that with people who might be interested to reach out beyond the space. So thank you so much for being our panelists. Something in me tells me that I'm going to be asking you guys to come again. So please just keep an eye out. Ndivile has shared her socials and how you can reach them. So please take advantage of these things. I'm saying what I'm saying, so please hear me. So thank you guys so much for agreeing to be part of the panel and for really giving us a lot to think about, but also a lot of tools that we can go home, we can go wherever we'll go, and we can use them in very practical ways. So I really want to say thank you so much for making your time, and thank you for giving me 17 extra minutes of your time as well. I really would like to say thank you so much.